and welcome to the webinar on the exchange and implementation of feminist inclusive service practices. We're going to be talking about the Practice Exchange Manual, which is a tool that was developed by Women's Shelters Canada to help women's shelters and transition houses scale up the knowledge exchange and practice exchange that they've already been doing for years on a horizontal grassroots level. And I'm just going to start sharing a slideshow with you, so it's not just my face that you see. So here we are. The Practice Exchange project is an element that we're sharing as part of the Open Doors project. The Open Doors project provides resources and training to shelter workers on how to better understand how trauma and violence may cause physiological changes and survival strategies which can trigger substance use and mental health concerns. Participants learn practical approaches to offering more inclusive and constructive practices and advocacy to help support women with combinations of trauma from abuse, mental health issues, and substance use. Many participants also become advocates for trauma-informed, evidence-based, and feminist-aligned approaches for an abuse-free future. So this presentation will have two parts. The first part will be an introduction to the Practice Exchange project, and then we'll go through some of the exercises in the Practice Exchange manual and talk about how they can be used to implement some inclusive service practices from the Open Doors project. So the Practice Exchange project was developed in part as a response to the need for a feminist model of knowledge exchange for women's shelters. There is a lot of documentation and literature out there about practice exchange and practice reproduction, but a lot of it is developed for large-scale corporations or really big, national or multinational nonprofits with more of a franchise approach. So it's very top-down, and a lot of the models are not really designed for a horizontal exchange of ideas and practices amongst equals. So this project sought to develop some models that would really be relevant to women's shelters. There's a part of the Women's Shelters Canada website that talks under the Knowledge Exchange tab that talks about the Practice Exchange project, and you can get there by going to www.nvaw.ca/PEP. And part of the web page is an inventory of promising practices where you can actually go through and read about some promising practices that are relevant to the work of women's shelters from all over Canada. So you can go through and read that, and that's something that we hope to expand over time. There's also links to worksheets and the practice implementation manual itself. So the practice implementation manual is the key piece of the project. It has three sections. First, the introduction to knowledge exchange, practice implementation, and sort of the feminist model behind it. And then we present the 10 steps model, and we go through those 10 by step. And then at the end, we have a wonderful case study on the Harmony Project out of Portage La Prairie in Manitoba, and copies of worksheets that you can download. So the worksheets are available in the manual itself, which is a free PDF download. And in some cases, you'll be lucky to get the physical copy. We don't have too many of those, but any participants in the Open Doors project will get their very own copies. And then the worksheets can also be downloaded individually from the NVAW website. So part of the challenge around the feminist approach to horizontal knowledge exchange is just that grassroots element. So a lot of the documentation and language around practice exchange talks about model practices, which is a really fantastic standard, but it's also a little bit hierarchical. So model practices have to be proven through consistent published evaluations, third-party evaluations, often using the scientific or medical model of triple blind testing with control groups to meet the highest formal standards for effectiveness. So this is the gold standard, but it's not accessible to everybody. A small organization wouldn't necessarily have the funding to do this kind of evaluation, and It's also very, expert-driven, hierarchical, costs a lot, and the model is very sort of one size fits all. So this type of practice exchange model in the practice implementation guide focuses more on promising practices, which have shown effectiveness through more informal methods, the type of knowledge and assessment that is used in grassroots organizations like women's shelters and transition houses on a day-to-day basis. So it really values the type of knowledge and assessment that happens through discussion with participants, discussion groups, informal, in-house type of assessment model. So women's shelters, feminist organizations are always doing assessment. They're always reflecting, is this working for us? It may not be the super academic formal models that are used in best practices, but we still value that type of knowledge and that type of reflection and assessment. And we'll talk more about that later on. The other advantage is that it's less expensive, and it's more flexible to be adapted to different local contexts and local knowledge. The other element is innovative practices. So that's when there's a new issue, a new challenge that's emerging. There isn't a lot of history around how to address it, but it's an urgent need, and the potential to share some innovative solutions to that need is really, really helpful for trying to stop those gaps and deal with those real life in our sector, potentially life-threatening situations, without having to recreate the wheel and do that research again and again and again. So this really applies to things like technological safety and emerging issues around a certain new policy or law that women's shelters need to address in a very prompt way. So just to clarify some of the language that we're using, practices are the building blocks from which projects, programs, and broader movements are constructed. So practice is a relatively simple step that addresses a relatively straightforward project. So something like a model policy, some paperwork, intake process would be a practice. Those can stack together to create a project. So a project would have an intake, assessment, eligibility, all these steps, and each of those would be a practice, but they would stack together to create a project. And a project would need a bigger team of people to be involved. A program would be a series of ongoing projects that build on each other. And even beyond a project, you can have a campaign or movement, such as the movement to create a national action plan on to end violence against women, which is addressing a very complex problem over many, many years with a huge amount of actors moving, and you're constantly reassessing and redesigning the campaign. So there's levels of complexity that grow, but they're all built with individual practices as the building block. Another element that I think that is really important to feminist knowledge exchange is the recognition of explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge. So the simplest way to explain the difference between those two is head knowledge versus heart knowledge. Explicit knowledge is the type of knowledge that can be written down in a manual, like this. This is a form of explicit knowledge because it's been written down and sort of numbered and laid out. So it's the type of knowledge that you can explain very clearly using words, using numbers. You can have graphs, you can have statistics. But then the other side of knowledge that really complements the explicit knowledge is the tacit knowledge, which is the type of knowledge that you absorb. It's more intuitive, it's more physical, and it's more emotionally connected. So this type of knowledge is really difficult to share in a guidebook or manual, but it sort of underpins the values and the practice, the actual delivery of the skills that explicit knowledge tries to encapsulate. So ways of sharing tacit knowledge are through job shadowing, mentoring, things like this Shelter Staff Exchange project that we offer to associate members here at Women's Shelters Canada, and really being absorbed and immersed in the values and practices of an organization or a culture or a group of people, like a women's shelter. So there's a lot of emotional knowledge and emotional labor that goes into the tacit knowledge side of things. And it's something that's not always valued and recognized in the literature, but it's a huge piece of the work that we do in the women's shelter and anti-violence movement. So why might shelters exchange practices? There's a whole bunch of reasons for this. One of them is just administrative needs. There might be a sudden need for a transportation policy that didn't exist before, but another shelter might have it. Getting a template from a sister organization is a lot faster and more efficient than developing it from scratch. And so it just makes sense. Sharing momentum can be another reason. So when a campaign or program is taking off in one community, it's obviously successful. That organization wants to share their success. It might take off and it might build a lot of momentum in other communities with adaptation along the way. Responding to technology shifts, it can take a lot of time to learn all the ins and outs of security procedures for cell phones, social media. There's always so much to learn. So when one organization has done some of the learning around that, if they can share it, it makes the response happen a lot faster on a larger scale. So that's a huge advantage. Sometimes practice exchange is motivated by funding opportunities. The funder may have said, oh, this is a really great practice and we want to replicate it. We want to share that and scale it up across a larger area. So they offer funding opportunities that are inspired by that and encourage collaboration between agencies who already deliver the program. And then sometimes a shelter might recognize that there's a gap between their values and the actions that they're currently doing. So they might want to say increase physical accessibility in their programs, and they might look to what other organizations have done and can they borrow some of those good ideas. So there's lots and lots of reasons. These are just a few. You might come up with a few on your own. So this practice exchange is something that women's shelters and transition houses and our whole sector have been doing automatically for a long time. It just makes sense. So we're, again, with this manual, we weren't trying to recreate the wheel. We were trying to really capture what works for women's shelters and turn it into a process that's a little bit easier to work through and hopefully scale up and encourage more of it. So you may be able to think of an inclusive service practice that your organization already does well and is proud of. How did you develop it? Did you already get inspiration from another organization or perhaps an organization in another sector and you've adapted it to your sector? Do you already share it? Are you already talking about your successes on social media, in your community, to your funders, to other sister organizations, maybe through email lists? So this is probably something that you're already doing, and most shelters and transition houses are already doing certain types of inclusive service practices that support women with mental health or substance use concerns, and certainly lots of inclusive service practices that are trauma informed and that are responding to women's experiences of violence. So so this is not new, but it's a system of thinking through it and scaling it up a little bit. So to do that, we developed the 10-step framework. The 10-step framework is a cyclical process rather than a linear progression. So there's 3 pieces to it: assess, plan, and act. And then each of the 10 steps can also have its own sort of sub-cycle of assess, plan, and act. And sometimes these steps might not happen in the linear order that they're presented here. So it's flexible, but I think it makes sense to think about them in this order. And I'll talk a little bit more about what all these different steps are. So the assess cycle is steps 1 to 3. And it's really gathering, sharing, and reviewing knowledge about the current situation in order to make an informed plan for change. So the first step is always building relationships. This is something that's always happening in the background. Relationships are the foundation upon which all the work that we do in our sector are formed. So we'll talk more about that in the next section, because we'll go through that exercise. But it's really the underpinning of everything. Step 2 is assessing needs. This is something that can be done formally, or it can just be done through a process of having knowledge of your community and the needs of your team and the women that you serve. And then step 3, assessing priorities and feasibility. And we'll talk more about that as well. The next phase is planning, and that's steps 4 to 7. So it's creating a step-by-step strategy for implementing the desired change. Step 4 is connecting with prior projects. So who's done this already? Where's the literature? Where's the documentation? Who can we talk to? Who are our resources that have done this before that we can learn from? Step 5 is forming an advisory team. If it's a simple practice like just changing your intake forms, your advisory team might just be 1 or 2 people that are actually staff that can just do it. If it's a project or a program or something that's really a major redesign or a major rethinking of how you work, you'd want to have a bigger team, maybe bring in some people from the community, maybe bring in some people from that prior project who can advise you. And then step 7 is create a resource plan. So what are your resources? What are your costs? How are you going to make this project happen materially with your team? Step 8 is actually acting, conducting the activities according to the plan. It's one step, but there's a lot of subsections of assess, plan, act within the delivery of the plan. And then to complete the cycle, a new round of assessment begins for step 9 and 10 to determine ways of improving the practice, project, or program, and then sharing that knowledge so that you get some credit for what you've done, so you get recognition, so your funders know what you've been up to, and we'll talk more about that later on as well. So we're going to go into some of the activities. I'm not going to go through all 10, but we'll skim through some of the highlights of some activities that are relevant to this work and think about how they are relevant to adapting inclusive service practices that help women with mental health concerns or substance use concerns. So reflection time. Think of an inclusive service process that your organization may like to implement. So what is a gap that you have? What do you need right now to make your organization more inclusive or better able to respond to the needs of women with mental health or substance use concerns? Which of the 10 steps would be most useful to you? And where do you see some potential challenges, and how might you overcome those challenges? I'd like to talk about the main activity for step 1, which is relationship building. This is something that you're doing all the time in the background. At every step, you're always building those relationships. There's 3 levels to the relationships. The first level is participants, so they're right at the center. So that's residents, program users, staff, volunteers, and board members. And when you're thinking about relationships, you're always thinking how strong are these relationships and how positive are these relationships. So if you've got distance, you don't have a lot of contact with these people, then they're not a very strong relationship. And if there's tension or there's conflict, then it's not a very positive relationship. So how can you make relevant relationships stronger and more positive so that you can work together and have a better foundation for the work that you do? Sometimes there's going to be ongoing conflict. The work that we do is about social change, and there's a certain amount of conflict and pushing that comes out of that in order to make change. So certainly with perpetrators and sometimes with the system that we work in. So so that's okay, but certainly being aware of that and looking at how do these relationships affect the work we do. Outside of the central participant circle, there's also the collaborators, so local organizations who also impact the direct needs of house participants. So that would be funders, local media, local organizations that you might partner with for program delivery. And then outside of that, there's funding, research, media, advocacy, and policymaking entities that shape the social context that you're working within. So you may have some relationships with some of those people, or it may just be a one-way relationship where they're influencing you. But often women's shelters are doing some larger scale work at that level as well. And that's all relationships. So we're going to skip ahead a bit and go to step 6, which is adapting the plan. This is a big part of it. So through the Open Doors project, through the practice, the inventory of promising practices, you may see some ideas that are really relevant to you, and start thinking, okay, how can we adapt these to work for our community? What works in one community may not work the same in another community, and thinking through the process of adaptation is really important to the success of any project. So this stage helps to transfer a sense of ownership of the project to the local team, and also just makes it more practical and feasible. So you'll be basing this on strong relationships, community needs assessment, your advisory committee, and all of the previous steps. One of the really useful ways that is presented here to come up with an implementation plan is a results-based management logic model. So a lot of you will be familiar with this because it's very popular with funders. So it's identifying the inputs, which are the resources required, the activities, so the actions that are conducted to achieve the outputs, and then the outputs are the direct products or services created by the activities. The outcomes are the direct changes caused by the output, things like access to resources, changed behavior, changed policies, and then the impact is the ultimate objective that the project or program is seeking, such as lower rates of violence. So it's a little bit harder to track the impact at that level sometimes, but that's what you're hoping to do with all those outcomes. When the outcomes stack together, they should be contributing to the ultimate impact, the ultimate objective. So these are some of the elements that you might think about when you're doing an adaptation plan. Are there evaluations and reports from previous practices that you're learning from? Do they have already challenges in learning that the developers of the project, of the original practice, have already addressed? Can you learn from that so that you don't have to recreate those same challenges? And how can you build on the successes of the original initiative? Branding, sometimes you can use the same branding, sometimes you're encouraged to use the same branding if you're really recreating the exact same idea that's brand new. But in some cases, if you're adapting it quite a lot, you'll want to really rename it, rebrand it. So make sure that you're talking to the original developers of the practice. If you're adapting something, figure out what is the appropriate response there. And if you are rebranding, how can you really reflect the spirit of the initiative in your community? Scale is a huge one. If you're going from a small town to a big city, you're going to need to adapt it. If it's something that was successful on a small scale and you want to take it to a bigger scale, you're really going to have to think about resources, timing, staffing, all of that piece. So it makes a big difference. There's also a difference between small town services and large town services. Cities get more people, there's more volume through the doors, and more diversity, but there's also a wide variety of sort of outsourcing and referrals that you can do through specialized services that exist in the bigger cities. Small towns have fewer people, but they have to do everything in-house if they're going to do it, because there's just not as many other organizations and resources to refer to. So it's a different approach. Thinking about your local collaborators. So who's your funder? Who are your partners in your community? And how will they influence the way that you might be able to deliver this type of practice or program? Timing. What's your timeline? It might be really different from the original practice. Is there a special event or anniversary that's coming up that might impact this delivery, either in a positive or a negative way? What about your collaborators' calendars? And how does the scale affect the timing? Terminology is a really important one in our sector, particularly because it developed at a grassroots level in different regions. The language that our sector uses in British Columbia versus Quebec versus the Maritimes and the Atlantic Canada is really different. And what even the term transition house means very different things across the country. The terms that are used for different programs can mean really different things, even if it's the same language. So making sure that you understand, if you're borrowing from a region that's really far away from you, making sure you understand what they mean when they use those terms versus what you might mean if you use those same terms in your region. So definitely making sure that you check in and ask those questions. Cultures is very important. Canada's super diverse. We have Indigenous cultures that vary from region to region. How can you reflect the local cultures in your initiatives planning, branding, language, materials? If you're not already consulting with community leaders, make sure you're doing that. It makes a huge difference. Infrastructure, again, this is a big town, small town thing, but every town and municipality is different. So what's your transportation, housing, safety, education, other structural factors? If there's fantastic, subway transport in the town that originally developed the practice, and then there's hardly any ability to get from neighborhood to neighborhood in your area, that might really impact the type of program that you deliver. And then resources, are you getting twice the funding, half the funding to do the same type of work? How is that going to affect how you deliver what you do? And then accessibility, always really important to consider. What did the original implementers do? What can you do that's taking accessibility a step further? All right, so step 8, we're skipping ahead again, is to actually deliver the plan. And I just want to highlight that in this step, there's really micro cycles of plan, act, assess, plan, act, assess. So you're always sort of going through those steps as you're delivering. There's no sense doing all of the assessment at the end and doing all of the planning at the beginning. You want to be keeping that cyclical, and trying to remember some SMART objectives, so specific, measurable, assignable, realistic, and time-centered. So keeping that going and really checking that along the way as you go. So assessment is a huge piece, and it really should filter into all the different steps. So in assessing the first phase, you can do the needs assessment. In planning and delivery, you can do a formative assessment, and at the end you can do a summative assessment. So a needs assessment is figuring out what you need before you actually start the project. Formative assessment is you're in the middle of the project and you're checking, how am I doing? Do I need to change what I'm doing? This is, I think, the most practical and useful type of assessment, where you're actually able to improve the outcome of the project while it's happening. So this is really where I think the bulk of the effort should be focused. It's also just much more grassroots. It's more helpful and participative for the actual women involved in the project, the actual participants and beneficiaries of the project. And I just think it's more useful. A summative assessment is an assessment that happens at the very end when the project is over or ending, and it's looking back and saying, did we meet our goals? Did we check our boxes? How did we do? It's often more qualitative. It's sometimes conducted by a third party, so it's too late to make changes based on that, but it's still a really good learning opportunity. Very few small nonprofit organizations actually have the funding to do a summative assessment or a summative evaluation, which is too bad because you can learn a lot from it. But some of them do an informal reflection process that achieves similar goals. One thing that I encourage people to think about when they're doing evaluation or assessment is, are there ways that this can benefit the participants directly? So when you're involving them particularly in assessment, and you're having them fill out forms or evaluations, how can that actually be helpful for their process, so that you're not just taking their time and energy for the greater benefit of the structural needs of the project, but how can that help in their reflection process and their journey? So that's something that I think is really part and parcel of the feminist approach to assessment. And sometimes it takes some communication with the funders to really explain that piece. Step 10, I really want to emphasize, it's about sharing knowledge. So I'm the knowledge exchange coordinator. This is very close to my heart. This is something that you often have to do with your funders to communicate how the project went and what you learned. But it's also a great opportunity to share with the participants, give them sort of a report back, to share with your board, to share with your community, to share with other women's shelters and transition houses. So when you share that knowledge, you increase your recognition, the recognition of the work that we do as a sector, and also the opportunity to do knowledge exchange is increased every time an organization shares knowledge, whether it's over social media, webinars, conferences, whatever mechanism works for you. And the 5 C's are a great concept to keep in mind. So clarity, being concise, being consistent, being compelling, and being continuous. So trying to keep repeating that message if it's something that's still really, really relevant. And then that really completes the cycle. So I'm going to end it here. There's a lot more that is available in here. The case study in the final section is really, really fantastic, and it goes through those 10 steps with a real example of a project out of Manitoba that really reflects these 10 steps. Even though it was a project that was done before I identified these 10 steps, I think it's a really great way of looking at it and thinking about it. And then there's the worksheets at the end that can be really useful, and they can be downloaded separately as well. This is available both on opendoorsproject.ca and www.nvaw.ca under the knowledge exchange section. So thank you so much for your time. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at either of those websites. My name is Heather Stewart, and thank you so much for listening.